Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, July 2nd, 2020, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2020 Senate election. So we actually have a number of races to dive into, so this video will be pretty long. I apologize for that, but there is a lot to discuss. We're not going to focus too much time on safe states. I think that's just overall a waste of time in general, so we're going to characterize those now. The Democratic Party is working with a map that isn't too favorable towards them. Yes, right now I would say that they are the likeliest party to have the Senate majority after 2020, but that is not without hard work. A lot of these Senate races should not necessarily be competitive, and they are. Whether that's the fault of the Republicans or the Democrats running up a campaign in a certain state, it's all going to be, beneficial towards the Democratic Party. But at face value, 3 years ago, I would have said the Democrats had no chance at winning back the Senate. So taking a look at this map, there are some interesting safe states. I consider the state of Massachusetts safe regardless of who that Democratic nominee is going to be. It doesn't matter if it's Joe Kennedy or Ed Markey. Right now, I will say Joe Kennedy seems to be ahead, but that is up to the voters on September 1st. As for other states that you may be surprised to see, such as safe for the Democrats, I consider Virginia, and I now consider Minnesota, Tina Smith's seat, as a safe seat. Both of these states I do think will be possibly 15-point margins, and I honestly don't think the Republican Party is going to put any type of, notable opponent against the Democrats here. The Democratic Party is going to run it up in the presidential level at least. In the Senate election, I think will outrun Joe Biden's margin. Virginia, I think, is going to be possibly a 10-point margin on the presidential level, probably somewhere between 6 to 10%. Minnesota, I can probably say the same thing. I do think that the Senate elections are going to outperform where Joe Biden is. So that leaves 44 safe Democratic seats, but that's not to say that there aren't safe Republican seats. A lot of these states are solid for the GOP. Ben Sass in Nebraska, or just taking a look around the country, actually not Mississippi. We'll talk about that one in just a moment. Tennessee, while it does have an open seat, I don't think the Democrats are going to have any type of Phil Bredesen type candidate. He came close but still lost by 10%. So I say, Tennessee goes to the GOP pretty solidly. I don't think the Democrats are really going to be focusing on that one too much. Oklahoma is another safe Republican state, and so is West Virginia. Now, I understand is the fact that West Virginia has I believe, Paula Jean Swearin. I know she ran against Richard Ojeda, who ended up losing the Senate primary. Neither of those candidates I really think would have made the Senate race competitive. It would be very difficult. Just because there was a hopeful race in 2018 or because Bernie Sanders won a primary here in 2016, that's no way an indicator of what will happen in the general election. And I think Donald Trump will absolutely win West Virginia by a solid margin. I absolutely think the Republicans will win every House race by a solid margin, win re-election to the governor's mansion, and also win the Senate race. So not much hope for Democrats there. I think 2018 is probably the last time we'll see a Democrat win statewide within the near future, with the exception of, maybe a governor's race here and there. So that leaves 39 safe Republican seats. That leaves 17 toss-up seats. And I know it's surprising seeing pretty much the entire Bible Belt considered to be a toss-up, but that's with a good reason. These states themselves have narrowed down from where they were just a year ago. States such as Georgia now have 2 Senate seats up, or South Carolina, which has shown signs of it narrowing down. North Carolina, which has taken a side in favor of the Democratic Party. Mississippi, another race that was actually close in the December 2018 Senate special election, or it could be 2019. This year was so long. It was definitely 2018. That one was within an 8% margin. The candidates are back up. Texas is close. Kansas, I know it's very surprising. Literally a couple of months ago, I would have said Kansas is safe for the GOP. So things are evolving in favor of the Democratic Party. Now, I do have some likely states that we should probably get out of the way because we don't need to talk about them too intently. We have John Cornyn in Texas. I think this race, while Joe Biden is narrowing up in the same exact polls that he's even leading in the Fox News poll, John Cornyn is leading by 9%. So while these states are going to the Democratic Party, not necessarily, but in the polls showing that the Democratic Party is favored to win in the state, I don't think the Democrats are going to win Texas, just clarification. But for the example of the Fox News poll, even in that situation, the Republican incumbent wins by 9%. So even in a scenario in which Biden wins Texas, the same voters that would elect Biden through Texas also want to vote for John Cornyn by 9%. So keep that in mind. Alabama, I actually think this one will be a likely Republican state. It's unfortunate for the Democrats that they couldn't find, a GOP candidate, couldn't pull Claire McCaskill and nominate someone who would be horrible. Right now, it's between Jeff Sessions and Tommy Tuberville. Regardless of who it is, they're both going to win by a likely margin. I think that's just how the race is going to go. Mississippi, while Mike Espy did put up a good fight against Cindy Hyde-Smith, they're both facing off against each other as well, and I do believe that it will still be a likely margin. I'm probably going to see something around 8%. But let's say Joe Biden does narrow down the state on the presidential level. The Senate race will absolutely be better for the Democrats than the presidential race, but that's only if Biden is able to focus on Mississippi, which 99% chance he's probably not going to spend too much money there. For South Carolina, this is Lindsey Graham's seat. Again, this state itself, it's just very interesting. It's probably going to be a toss-up state in 2024, 2028, just because of the increasing African-American population, and of course that in turn turns to Democratic votes. But South Carolina, in this Senate election, Lindsey Graham is a not necessarily popular incumbent, but very well-known incumbent. Jamie Harrison still has some name recognition buffs to go over, and also the fact that he is a Democrat in a solid GOP state on the presidential level isn't exactly going to be super easy to win this statewide race. While it's hopeful for some Democrats, realistically, Jamie Harrison is not going to win. So that goes into the likely Republican column. I don't know why I keep flipping that. For Kentucky, Amy McGrath just won that Senate race primary, which means that she will be facing against incumbent Senator Mitch McConnell, who, yes, has a 34% approval rating, 38% I think now. I think it went up 4% from 2014. But even when he's always been unpopular. That's the one thing. It's not new. He's not all of a sudden just becoming unpopular, which does not mean this Senate race is all of a sudden super competitive because of his unpopularity rating. In 2014, Allison Lonergan Grimes was older than Mitch McConnell's approval rating. So he was at 34%, and it was not necessarily, obviously not a good number for the Senate Majority Leader, but he ended up winning the election by nearly 15%, and he likely will do the same in 2020. Amy McGrath, well, yes, Charles Booker probably would have done better in the primary if he had gotten those endorsements before. I realistically think neither of them could have won. I don't think that Kentucky was going to be close. Yes, it's not safe, which is still a plus for the Democrats, but a loss is a loss. You don't get the Senate seat, and it doesn't help your majority. So that puts 12 toss-up seats. Let's go ahead and look around the map. Another likely Republican state is Alaska's Senate race. This is a race that I consider to be likely. Dan Sullivan, elected back in 2014 by a very narrow margin in a Republican wave year, doesn't exactly have the best numbers going into 2020. While he does lead in preliminary data from a year and a half ago, there hasn't been any new data that gives us an idea of where the Alaska Senate race stands. And, Al Gross is an independent running in the independent Democratic independence libertarian primary, whatever they want to call it. But Al Gross is likely to lead the Democrats in their Senate race there. He would be an independent candidate. So he actually has a pretty good shot. The House race is showing that it's narrowed up with an independent candidate again. Again, both of these independents will likely caucus with the Democratic Party, but the fact that it's close is very interesting. I do think Alaska still will be within the likely margin. Same thing on the presidential level. And typically, the Senate Democrats outperform the Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. So keep that in mind. 44 Democratic seats, 45 Republican seats. Let's go ahead and see if there's any other likely states. Taking a look at the Georgia Senate special election, I actually think that one I would consider to be likely. This is a state that has two Senate elections, but there are no notable Democrats running. That's so unfortunate for the Democratic Party. This state, could you find a better area for the Democrats to pick up? Yes, it would be difficult, but it is doable. If Stacey Abrams had ran in the Senate special election, a lot more attention would be on that race. You could have taken so many other more powerful Democrats and ran them in these Senate elections, and they realistically would have had a chance. If Joe Biden was coming super close and the Democrats outperform his margin, they absolutely could have won. And the problem with the Senate special election is that, neither of the Democrats are really focused too much on this race. It doesn't even matter. At this point, they may not even come up on the runoff ballot. All polling data indicates that there will be two GOP candidates going into the runoff, which means it's absolutely going to be a Republican hold. It couldn't be anything different. For the Georgia general election, I will say Jon Ossoff actually has a pretty good chance. A lot of data shows that this race has narrowed down from where it was before. And, we have to go ahead and take a closer look at it. But Georgia's general election is going to be a little bit closer. If not a lot closer than the Senate special election. So 46 Republican seats, 44 Democratic seats. Taking a look at some other likely Democratic states, though, we have yet to fill those in. We have Colorado. This is a state that Cory Gardner holds the race in. He's a Republican incumbent, won narrowly in 2014, and has voted with Donald Trump's agenda 90% of the time. And that's very unfortunate for him. He is not liked amongst Colorado voters. John Hickenlooper is a former governor. Despite any type of ethics violations that John Hickenlooper has, it doesn't matter. Cory Gardner's not going to win. It didn't even matter if it was Andrew Romanoff or not. Hickenlooper was probably going to be the nominee, and he's almost absolutely going to win the general election. Cory Gardner, I realistically do not see having a chance at his re-election bid. For Michigan, this is another state, Gary Peters. He actually does just as well as Joe Biden as he's doing on the presidential race, which maybe not necessarily the best news if Biden was within Hillary Clinton's numbers, but Joe Biden is at an 8 to 9 point lead statewide in Michigan. So is Gary Peters. And, John James ran in 2018, had a pretty close race with Debbie Stabenow, but it actually is a very real possibility Gary Peters outperforms her margin. Before, I would have characterized this race as lean. I didn't think that he would do so, but now taking a look at all of the data that we have compiled, Gary Peters is doing a very good job at this race. And, I don't think the Republicans are really going to be focusing too much on Michigan when they're possibly losing a Senate race in Kansas and Iowa and, have to focus some energy on Alabama and Alaska and Georgia and South Carolina. So priorities are very important for the GOP, and I don't think Michigan is one of their top choices to attack for the 2020 Senate election campaigns. A lot of what they're going to be doing is damage control because they know the Democrats are almost absolutely going to pick up seats. For New Hampshire, this is another state I would characterize to be likely. Jeanne Shaheen, she's popular. She's a very well-known senator. She has done well in her elections in the past, and I also will say that there's no notable Republican running against her. That's the problem. The Republican Party has failed to field candidates that could actually win these elections by pretty substantial margins or even come close, and it's not doing too well for them. In New Hampshire, they're not getting a good Republican. They should have probably primaried the incumbent for all they care in Colorado. Michigan, John James, yes, is a stronger candidate, but not enough to win the race. They don't really have any in Minnesota or Virginia or New Mexico. So those races, which would previously be characterized as toss-ups, absolutely were toss-ups before, I would say are now solid for the Democratic Party. So we actually have one more race that I characterized as likely in my last video that I stand by, and that is the state of Arizona. As I move Arizona into the likely Democratic column on the presidential level, I am more than confident that it will be a likely margin in the Senate level. Martha McSally is not liked. She lost in 2018, was appointed a year after. Can you imagine someone worse for the Republican Party? Someone who had just lost an election? Chris Kobach. But Arizona, I would say, it has taken a lot closer of a turn towards the Democratic Party. The presidential election looks like Arizona's going to go to Joe Biden. The Senate election, Mark Kelly is outperforming Biden sometimes by 5-6%. Mark Kelly nearly has a double-digit lead in the state of Arizona, led by 13 in a Fox News poll that is A- rated from 538. So Arizona, I absolutely do believe will be a likely margin. Now, likely means anywhere from 6 to 15%, but still, we could possibly see it on the, maybe on the lower end of the 10s, possibly even that margin if the trend continues for the Democrats nationwide. So that actually puts the Democrats one seat ahead of where they were just last year. Democrats are at 48. The Republicans are at 46. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the, I guess you could say, lean Republican states, and then go on to the lean Democratic states. Kansas, I consider to be a lean Republican state. This is because Chris Kobach is the number one the front runner for the Republican primary right now, according to all of the data. And I think the problem is that he has lost a previous election. Yes, he isn't liked too much by Republican voters or just Kansas voters altogether, but it is a presidential election year. Even though Barbara Bollier will probably have a very easy election against Chris Kobach, I still think that she's going against the overall majority of the state. It's a Republican state. Trump is absolutely going to carry Kansas. I just think that, seeing Chris Kobach as the nominee narrows down the race significantly, but I'm not too confident in saying that Kansas will absolutely go to the Democrats, especially since the primary is going to be held in around a month, and then I can probably get closer of an update towards that. So Kansas goes to the GOP, but narrowly. Let me think. Are there any other lean states for the GOP? I actually wouldn't consider any other states to be lean. For the Democrats, I do consider the state of Maine to be a lean Democratic state. I was dabbling whether or not I would consider it to be likely, but then again, Susan Collins has proven herself time and time again that she can win her re-election bid. Sarah Gideon, I think, has an absolutely very strong chance at winning in the state of Maine, but I will say that there are some warning signs that, Maine does like to elect bipartisan senators, and even though, Susan Collins voted for Brett Kavanaugh and made a number of other votes that were beneficial to the Trump agenda, not so much to what the Maine voters wanted, which has all of a sudden, dropped down her approval rating significantly, almost 40% from 2016. I do think that the race is winnable for the Democrats, absolutely, but it's also still winnable for Susan Collins. So I'm not going to characterize it as likely yet. Probably still lean, probably throughout the entire campaign, to be completely honest. Another lean Democratic state is the state of North Carolina. Cal Cunningham is doing just as good, if not better, than Joe Biden in the state. I believe there was maybe one poll that showed him underperforming Joe Biden, but at the same time, a lot of other data does not necessarily agree with that. Yeah, Joe Biden and Cal Cunningham are probably going to run around the same margin realistically, but I do think that Roy Cooper being on the ballot is going to help the Democratic Party, not significantly, but enough to push them over the top in both the presidential race and the Senate race. People are probably going to end up voting down ballot, and yes, if people are voting for Joe Biden, they're probably voting for Roy Cooper, absolutely, and probably for Cal Cunningham as well. I do think North Carolina is taking a little bit of a turn towards the left, especially if Joe Biden chooses a woman of color as VP. I do think the Democratic Party will be at a very good stance going into the 2020 Senate election. So that leaves 3 toss-up seats. The Democrats essentially win the majority because I do project Joe Biden wins the election. But let's say Donald Trump wins, it would mean that the Republicans, if they picked up all the remaining 3 seats, they would end up winning the majority. But unfortunately for the GOP, I will characterize Iowa and Georgia as tilt races. Now, it's very surprising to me. I would never even consider Georgia to be tilt. I started off my projections for 2020 Senate with Georgia as a likely state. That was one step over from safe. And, the fact that Georgia has narrowed up partly has to do with Jon Ossoff, but also Joe Biden. Joe Biden seems to be doing a lot better than Hillary Clinton in this state. And also, there's a lot more minority voters that actually want to vote than where they, voted in 2016. Some of them didn't even vote. 59% turnout compared to 66% turnout amongst black voters from 2016 to 2012, respectively. Meaning the Democratic Party didn't run up the numbers the same way they did in the past. They can't win elections unless, minorities turn out to vote. And unfortunately for the Democratic Party, they didn't have that in 2016, but they absolutely do have that in 2020. We're seeing it nationwide. And while I do think that Georgia and Iowa will still go to the GOP, I think Georgia will absolutely narrow up from where it was before. I characterize this race as lean. It could move back there, but I do think Jon Ossoff will narrow down this race, especially if neither candidate gets 50% in that runoff election, depending on who wins the presidency. If it's Donald Trump, Ossoff wins. If it's Joe Biden, David Perdue wins. Now for Montana, this is the last race I actually need to characterize. I'm going to stick with my characterization before. Steve Bullock actually just knew data out, thankfully, for the first time in a very long time. Steve Bullock leads Steve Daines by 4%, 47 to 43, but that's a lot of undecided voters. And in a state that gave Donald Trump the victory by 20%, that type of split literally narrows up the race to 50-50. So I do think Steve Bullock will narrowly have the edge over Steve Daines, but it's going to be very difficult. And I do think that it's doable, and I think the Democratic Party right now is the favorite just because of their very aggressive stance against Donald Trump and very good position nationwide, but I will say that that race is really too close to call, along with Georgia and Iowa. But other than that, the rest of these races probably won't change much unless anything drastically changes about the candidates themselves. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Go ahead and check out the video on your screen for you, and then a playlist for 2020 Senate races where you can check out each individual state that I consider to be a toss-up. Go ahead and check out our Instagram. We just reached 1,000 followers. Thank you guys so much for that on Instagram and my Twitter at LT Elections. Please consider joining as a member on my channel. And again, thank you all for watching this video, and I will see you all tomorrow.